Interested in learning about wine, but not sure where to start? You're in the right place. Welcome to the Cork and Fizz Guide to Wine podcast. I'm your host, Haley Bowman, and I'm so glad you're here. I'm a wine enthusiast turned wine educator and founder of the Seattle-based wine tasting business, Cork and Fizz. It is my goal to build your confidence in wine by making it approachable and lots of fun. You can expect to learn everything from how to describe your favorite wine to what to pair with dinner tonight, and so much more. Whether you're a casual wine sipper or a total cork dork like myself, this podcast is for you. So grab yourself a glass and let's dive in. Today's episode is all about orange wine, and we're going to go ahead and say it. Orange wine is not made from oranges, but it's totally understandable that you might think that. The term orange actually refers to the color that the wine usually appears to be. So think of it the same way as white wine looks white, red wine looks red, just referring to the color here, not referring to the fruit that makes it. So what is orange wine then? How does it get that color? So orange wine is essentially a white wine that's made like a red wine. But what do I mean by that? Well, when you take a white wine, you typically crush the grapes. First off, we're starting with white or green grapes, you might call them. So you're going to crush those grapes, then you're going to transfer them to a press, where it does exactly what it sounds like it would do. It presses the grapes to extract the juice and leave behind the grape skins. Then the juice is taken to ferment and make into wine. So again, white wine, notice that we're leaving behind the grape skins and the seeds. Now, when you make red wine, you're going to go straight to the fermentation stage after crushing the grapes. So you ferment with all the skins and the grape seeds included. The pressing doesn't happen until after fermentation has ended. So when you make an orange wine, you use white grapes, but you follow the red winemaking technique. You crush the grapes, and then you go straight to putting them in some sort of vessel, an oak barrel, steel tank, clay pot. Put it in that vessel to ferment, keeping the skins and the seeds of the grape in contact with the juice. Now, a fun fact, the color of orange wine comes primarily from a complex polymer called lignin, which is actually found in the grape seeds, not the skin. I know for me, when I first learned about orange wine, I just assumed the color came from being in contact with the skin, so that there was like a pigment in the skin of the grapes and it turned it orange. I don't know why orange instead of green, but in my head I was like, great, it's the skin. That's what does it. Turns out a lot of it comes from the grape seeds. This lignin that is found in the grape seeds is also what makes woody stuff taste, well, like wood. So if you'll notice that when we mention a couple of the tasting notes in orange wine, one thing that comes up is the wood varnish, and that is from our lignin. Grape seeds contain one of the highest compositions of lignin in nature. So there's a lot of science and experimenting going on with using the grape seeds to produce different things and more, what do I want to say, renewable resources. Now, going back, it's a little too much science for us. The color can also come somewhat from the skin of the grapes, but not in the way that you may be thinking, or at least how I was thinking before. You see, white grapes lack anthocyanins. These are the phenolic compounds in red or black grapes that make red wine red. Instead, other phenolic reactions take place to create that orange hue that you see in orange wine. What's interesting is if you inspected orange wine under a microscope, you wouldn't find orange pigment. Instead, you'd find dilute red pigment. This is from the small phenolic molecules joining in pairs and trios. And you'll find this amber brown pigment, which is partly the result of increased exposure to oxygen that the juice experiences during the skin maceration process. That skin maceration process, again, is just the time when the juice is in contact with the skins of the grapes. This oxidation is the same principle as if you would slice an apple, sit it out, and it begins to turn brown, right, with contact with the air. So the air exposure that it gets when it's sitting in that vessel, typically they won't have it, it'll have it open so that it has a little bit more oxygen contact. And so though the air exposure is generally minimal when we think about these wines, it's enough for the wine to take on a little bit of color. So a little bit of red pigment, a little bit of amber brown ends up getting us that orange hue in our wine. Temperature also plays a key role here. So the warmer the fermentation, the deeper the color of the wine will be. And because I know you're probably curious, yes, orange wine is different from rosé. They may look fairly similar when you see them in the bottle, but they're actually quite different. One might even say they're opposites. You see, rosé is made with red or black grapes, but with little to no skin contact, or contact with the seeds, we should say. And an orange wine is made with white grapes, but with skin contact. Thus, a rosé is essentially a red wine that's made like a white wine. Remember, we're using red grapes, but no skin contact. And an orange wine is a white wine made like a red wine. We're using those white grapes, but we're getting contact with the skins and the seeds. So now you know, rosé, orange wine, essentially opposites. Now, the next question, if you're anything like me, would be, well, why do we bother to make orange wine? We have white, we have red, we have rosé. We're pretty happy, right? Why do we bother with orange wine? Well, I think it's important to know that orange wine isn't some new trendy thing. The term orange wine might be. It was coined by a British wine importer, David Harvey, in 2004. But before that, these wines were called skin contact or traditional white wines. And rather than a trend, you can consider this interest in orange wine to be a resurgence, because this style of wine dates back over 6,000 years to the ancient world of wine, specifically in Eastern Europe, now Georgia, and Northeast Italy and Slovenia. So let's dive into the history a little bit, and I'll come back, or at least answer during the history portion, the question of why orange wine. So orange wine originated, like we said, in Eastern Europe and specifically in Georgia. And this is where that wine has been made for more than 6,000, or even some experts say 8,000 years. Production began along the cloud-cast peaks of the Caucasus Mountains, in fortress-like monasteries where Assyrian monks loaded crushed grapes, skin, stems, and all, into these giant clay pots called qvevri, which were buried in the ground for temperature control. So these qvevri, think of them as they're these clay vessels, and they were lined and sealed with beeswax. Now, there were a couple motivations for making wine in this way. First, there was no modern technology to help with removing the skins from the grapes, and in many instances, the grapes needed to be hand-peeled. No one wanted that job. Also, the skins of the grapes gave the wine tannins, which were essential in preserving the wine longer in a time where refrigeration didn't exist. In fact, one of the main reasons we know of white wine as it is today was the onset of refrigeration in 1834. The crisp, chilled white wine became a mainstay in Parisian cabarets and eventually a global commodity. But we never would have had that without refrigeration. So why don't we see a bunch of Georgian orange wine today? Well, the country's winemaking tradition remained unchanged until 1921. And that was when Russia's Red Army usurped Georgia, mechanizing its centuries-crafted wine production for the sake of volume over quality. They didn't care what they were making as long as they were making a lot of money. Georgia wasn't able to restore their tradition until the early to mid-1990s. However, when they did, a lot of countries like Slovenia, Croatia, and even Italy's Friuli region followed suit. They revived their long-buried vinicultural traditions. Slovenian and Friulian winemakers were inspired by Georgia because they had gone through something similar. A lot of these people who are making very commercial, large-scale, and what you might call clean wine saw an opportunity to reclaim their cultures. Now, the orange wine process was actually popularized, or at least what we think of it as today, was popularized in Italy by the winemaker Josco Gravner, who first attempted an orange wine in 1997. He was a highly acclaimed producer of technical, stylish, Friulin wine, and he gained that fame very early. But he underwent a crisis of faith in the mid 1990s, realizing that he simply didn't enjoy drinking his own wines anymore. And you'll notice if you talk to any winemaker, it's very, very important that you enjoy drinking your own wines. So he went on this so told perilous journey into the mountains and encountered millennia old Georgian viticultural traditions. And this is what inspired him to change how he was making his wine and began making it in this orange wine style. A lot of today's orange winemaking can be found in northeastern Italy, along that border of Slovenia in Friuli, Venezia Giulia, or what I've been calling for short, just Friuli. This is where you can find a lot of orange wines produced with the indigenous grapes of the regions. You'll find Sauvignon Vert, which is also called Friulano, Ribolla Gialla, and Pinot Grigio. But we'll talk a little bit more about the region later when we talk about our different regions you can find orange wine. So we know why they made orange wine in the past, right? But why the resurgence now? And I think we can look to Josko Gravner for the answer for that, right? It's this essentially the reclaiming of a culture, right? As we mentioned previously. And it also adds this new dimension to white wine. It's the addition of texture, body, and flavor. You get the acidity of a white wine with the aromatics and mouthfeel of a red wine. So I'm not saying it's better by any means. It's just different and it's something new. And I feel like in the wine world, as much as we love tradition, we're also always happy to find something new, even though this is kind of a new old situation that we have going on. I think one of the other reasons for this resurgence is the natural wine movement. Orange wine, though not always made in the natural wine style, is often made that way. And while there's not a strict definition for natural wine, this generally means the grapes are organically or biodynamically grown and hand harvested. There's only native yeast used, so any yeast found naturally in the winery or on the skins of the grapes, all that can be used to make the wine. Nothing is added to the wine except for 50 ppm of sulfites to help with stability, and the wine is often unfined and unfiltered, giving it a little bit of a hazy look. Now, if you're curious about natural wine, good news. We're going to be learning more about this with a future guest who is an expert on natural wine. So I'm going to let her handle going into the details on that. But essentially, this movement for natural wine, I think, kind of connects us to the orange wine, as orange wine really is kind of that original natural wine, because all they had to put everything in the pot, make it from there, and they didn't have the ability to do all of the filtering and the fining and adding of sulfites that we do today. So kind of connected. All right, now let's talk a little bit about the different styles of orange wine, because here's the thing. One orange wine at the wine shop can be wildly different from another. And so it's important to know kind of what are some different things that the winemakers can do to make these changes, and then also, different things like the grapes and the climate and how those impact the resulting orange wine. Now, before we go into that, let's start by saying orange wine goes by many different names. You'll find orange wine, but you'll also find amber wine, skin contact wine, skin fermented wine, and ramato, which means auburn in Italian. I also really quickly want to cover just the common aromas and flavors before we dive into, where those differences can be found. So when we think about common aromas, you can get things like honeyed aromas of jackfruit. And if you're like, Haley, I've never had jackfruit in my life, what the heck does a jackfruit taste like? No worries, I got you. I've also never tasted jackfruit, so I had to look this up. But think like tropical mango, pineapple, banana. Like it's a very tropical flavor. You also have hazelnut, overripe apple and pear, sun-baked hay, wood varnish, thanks to that lignin, juniper, think like gin, and sourdough. Now, on the palate, it can be quite big and dry. And when I say dry here, I mean it is tannic. These things will have tannin. Remember, those are the things that make your mouth feel dry, right? You get your gums want to stick to your cheeks. That's due to tannin. And because this wine was in contact with the skin and the seeds of the grape, you're going to get that. The wine can be very intense, so many recommend sitting down when you taste your first orange wine, or at least just be prepared for it. And you can also often equate orange wine to being very cider-like. People find a similarity between cider and fruit beers when they try orange wine. Okay, now Let's go into all of those decisions that winemakers can make when making orange wine that control which of these flavors are present and what their ultimate wine will look, smell, and taste like. So, first, when choosing a grape varietal, do they go for an aromatic variety or a non-aromatic? And what I mean by that, so a lot of times you can break up white wines in particular into aromatic or non-aromatic. So for the non-aromatic, you have neutral grapes, and these would be things like Chardonnay, Pinot Blanc, or even Aligote. This is a white grape that's grown primarily in the Burgundy region. It's the other one besides Chardonnay that's allowed to grow there, but you can also find it throughout the world. And these wines, remember from the Chardonnay episode, they're like blank slates. The winemaker kind of gets to choose what to do with them. There's no inherent smell naturally that comes with those. These wines, if you're going to make an orange wine from them, are going to be more about the texture and the structure of the wine. While on the other hand, aromatic varieties like, let's say, Muscat or Gewürztraminer, these are grapes that just are very perfumed. They have, like, when you have them in the glass, you know, because you can smell them from a mile away. So the skin contact with these brings an extra dimension. It adds a little bit of this reminiscent nut and dried fruit aroma, and it just adds these deeper tones, which can be a really great counterpoint to that very perfumed character of the varieties. So besides what grape variety they pick, grape ripeness level needs to be managed. This is super important. And it needs to be managed more like a red wine than it would for white again. And this is because the juice is going to be in contact with the skins. So unripe skins and seeds and stems can create quite a harsh taste, especially if the acid in the grape is very high. This is something you'll see in cool climate reds as well. If it wasn't a warm year, you can get a little bit of this harshness to it, and that's something they want to avoid. So they really have to keep an eye on how ripe the grapes become. They're also going to look at how long the maceration, again, the skin in contact with the grapes, and the fermentation periods are. You might assume that a shorter maceration would generally give you a lighter wine with fewer tannins, compared to a wine that stays on the skin for several months. But that's actually far from being the case. Some white grapes are just highly tannic, and if the grapes are macerated aggressively, meaning just in warm temperatures, lots of moving around of the grape skins in the juice, a few days might be enough to produce something very grippy and almost astringent for an orange wine. At the other end of the spectrum, spending a long time on the skins after fermentation can actually lead to significant what's called a polymerization. Yeah, we're getting sciencey. And what this does is it causes the tannins to become more of a silky, refined mouthfeel. So again, the time doesn't always matter. It kind of depends on the grape and depends on how you're doing that maceration and the fermentation process. Do you ever find yourself standing in front of the wine aisle at the grocery store, feeling completely lost and overwhelmed? Don't worry, you're not alone. But what if I told you that I have a way to transform the wine aisle from overwhelming into an endless sea of joy and discovery? And it involves drinking wine and joining the most welcoming and fun community. In my Court Crew virtual tasting club, we're all about exploring new and exciting wines in a fun and supportive community. No more feeling intimidated or stuck in a rut of buying the same bottle of wine. Each month, we explore 2 new wines, so you can broaden your palate and explore new flavors. Not only will we taste these wines together, but we'll learn about where the wines come from, essentially traveling the world all through the wine in our glass. Come join the Court Crew, and you'll have the opportunity to taste new wines, meet winemakers and other wine professionals, and connect with like-minded wine lovers from all over the world. Imagine the joy of discovering a new favorite wine and being able to confidently choose a bottle that you know you'll love. So, why not join us? Head to my website at corkandfizz.com/thecourtcrew to sign up. And don't forget to use code WINE101 to get your first month free. And now, back to the show. As we know, warmer temperatures will lead to a darker amber color, but it could also lead to less aromatic compounds. So they really kind of got to find the perfect balance between those. Lastly, and I kind of touched on this a little bit when we talked about that aggressive maceration, while the grape juice is fermenting, the grape skins tend to float to the surface. Now, winemakers want to continually incorporate these grape skins with the juice. The way they do that so they can extract all the color and all the flavor from the skin, right? We don't just want it on the top and want that little bit of wine that's at the top touching it. We want all of the juice touching these grape skins. So there are two techniques that they use to submerge the grape skins in with the wine. The first is called a punch down, which again, this sounds exactly like, this is exactly what it sounds like. Either a machine or a person uses a large tool, kind of looks like a giant potato masher, to punch the grape skins back into the juice. The other method is called a pump over, and this is where a hose is attached at the bottom of a tank, and it's used to pump juice from the bottom to over the top of the vat. These are processes that are done during fermentation of red and orange wines to ensure all the juices contact with the skins and the seeds. And some winemakers might choose the pump over the punch down as it's more delicate on the grapes. However, others have chosen just doing fewer punch downs to keep the wines elegant and not too harsh. Okay, phew, that's a lot about making orange wine. Now, if you're like, okay, I want to try some, but where do I find it? Let's talk about 5 popular regions where you are going to find orange wine. Now, again, I think you can find orange wine just about anywhere now. These are going to be kind of the top 5 that's both traditional and also where I found some really great orange wine. So starting off, Georgia. Georgia is a great place for an introduction to orange wine. Of course, you're probably not going to find these on your grocery store shelves. You are going to have to search out a local wine shop or maybe do some shopping online to find these, but they really are delicious. It's where they started making orange wine, right? So they kind of have a leg up on the competition in that way. The wines have a really unique textured flavor, and this can come from what's called ratsili. Probably didn't say that right. Ratsitili. There we go. That sounds about right. From red-stemmed grapes. And these are ancient pale skin variety in Georgia, which they use a lot to make orange wine. It is known to produce wine with a deep red-orange hue. So really beautiful wine too. Okay, next up, we're going to head to Friuli. And this is in Italy. It's in northeastern Italy specifically, along the border of Slovenia. And the whole region is technically called Friuli Venezia Giulia, but I typically shorten it to Friuli. Here you can find orange wines produced with the indigenous grapes of the region. Remember, we talked about this before. So Sauvignon Vert, that is Friulano, Ribiola Gialla, and Pinot Grigio, also called Pinot Gris in France, if you're curious. Many of these orange wines are aged in oak, so they have a little bit more of a rounder, and it kind of helps take an edge off the sour flavor. However, here they still use those minimalist intervention techniques to make the orange wine, so they're kind of in line with that natural wine movement. This is also where most orange wine in the world comes from, believe it or not. One of the top producers here, Radicon, is one of those splurge-worthy wines that I would recommend if you have some money burning a hole in your wallet. This could be a good opportunity to give this a try. Radicon is just kind of known around the world as one of the top orange wines. So Radicon began making orange wine when the late Stanko Radicon began his stewardship of the 18 hectares of vineyards. It was located near the Slovenian border. And he came to the conclusion that the local indigenous grape that they were growing, Ribiola Gialla, it needed to be treated differently to the other varieties that he was making if it wanted to reach its full potential. So that is where he set out changing his methods, and he pioneered this movement towards both natural and orange wines in Friuli. Okay, our next region is Slovenia. This is just over the border from Friuli. So, right, we're in the same kind of area there, same kind of northeast Italy region, if that helps you put it on a map in your head better. They also have a long history of orange wine making. This wine is very well integrated here, and you'll often see wines poured in just standard glasses like beer. So, sounds like a place I need to go. Grapes of choice here include more of those aromatic varieties. So you've got Muscat, Malvasia, and then of course along with the very popular Pinot Grigio or Pinot Gris. Fun fact, here in Slovenia, there is another odd wine, if you want to consider orange wine to be odd, but this other odd wine is called Motnik, and it is made in a natural method in barrels that are disinfected by smoking herbs like rosemary, bay leaves, and sage. So if you ever see it, give it a try. I know I'll be on a lookout for it. Our next region is Australia. The more progressive Aussie winemakers have started to make orange wines, primarily with Sauvignon Blanc. And this absolutely works wonders in this style. Popular regions for this would be the Adelaide Hills and the McLaren Vale. So that's where a lot of the orange Sauvignon Blanc orange wine will be coming from. And last but not least, we can't forget the United States. The US is not to be left out of anything trendy. We love jumping on anything that's trendy. US winemakers are known for being incredibly experimental, and that's exactly what they're like with orange wine. Popular spots for orange wine at the moment in the US include New York and California, but I've also seen examples from Oregon and Washington, and I'm sure somebody listening to this knows of states in the US besides those that are also making great orange wine. In New York, they use a grape variety called a Arcotsatelli. I had to put a pronunciation of that in my notes because, oof, that's a mouthful. Arcotsatelli. It's RkatSiteli. It's a grape that Georgian winemakers actually also use for orange wine often. So they've brought it over and planted it in New York, which I think is pretty cool. In California, you'll see all kinds of different varieties being made into orange wine. Some that I've seen include Pinot Gris or Pinot Grigio, the Ribolla Gialla, which again comes from that Friuli region in Italy. I've also seen Viognier, Chardonnay, and even Riesling as well. 3 producers that you can find in the States that I think make a great orange wine: Final Girl out of California, Field Recordings, and also 2 Vintners, which is based here in Washington. All right, before I let you go try all of this delicious orange wine, let's cover a little bit of the logistics. So things like serving temperature. When it comes to serving orange wine, you basically want to try it at the cool but not cold range. So it's about 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit. It's a good way to express a good balance of the aromatics and the mouthfeel. So to achieve this temperature, you could store the wine in your fridge and then remove it about 30 minutes before you plan to enjoy it. Also, don't be afraid to use a decanter with your orange wines. If it's tasting a little dull or if it's just a little overwhelming, throw it in a decanter, try it after 15 minutes, try it after 30 minutes, and give it a try then and see if it's opened up a little bit and kind of mellowed out. Orange wine is great when paired with food. It's absolutely perfect in this way. If you're overwhelmed by it by itself, try to pair it with some food. So because of its boldness, orange wines pair really well with equally bold foods. So think curry dishes, Moroccan cuisine, Korean dishes with fermented kimchi like bibimbap, and traditional Japanese cuisine, including fermented soybeans. They are also bright enough to pair with vegetables and fish, along with being substantial enough to pair with meat dishes. Now, my favorite wine and food cookbook pairs orange wine with a delicious porcini mushroom stroganoff. The funky flavors of the orange wine really pump up that like umami flavor in the dish. Makes for a beautiful pairing. You can find me on Instagram. I share this cookbook there. I think it's just called Wine and Food or Wine Food, something like that. Really amazing cookbook. And like I said, this orange wine and porcini mushroom stroganoff is so good. When it comes to how much to spend on a bottle of orange wine, it used to be that you had to spend, at least $80 to get a good bottle of orange wine. That is not the case anymore. You can easily find great examples in the $20 to $30 range. Now, one thing to keep in mind, the bottles won't always say that it's an orange wine. So be sure to ask at your local wine shop for some help. Many shops will have specific sections now, but not all of them. Recently, I was at a great little small wine shop in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And while they did have a section of orange wine, they also, when I asked for, I was like, okay, what's your favorite orange wine in the shop? They went and grabbed one that was hidden in the Italian wine section. So again, don't hesitate to ask for help. You're going to find some great bottles that way. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed learning about orange wine in this episode of the Cork and Fizz Guide to Wine podcast. If you love this episode as much as I did, I'd love it if you could take a quick second to rate it and leave a review. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. We release new episodes every Wednesday. In next week's episode, I'll be doing my best to give you a basic intro to French wine. There's a lot to talk about, so I'll only be covering a very small portion, but it'll be perfect if you're interested in trying French wine, but you're not quite sure where to start. This will be a good place to start. Thanks again for listening, and if you want to learn more about wine, come follow me at Cork and Fizz on Instagram. And to try more wines outside of your comfort zone, like maybe some of these orange wines, be sure to sign up for my virtual tasting club, The Cork Crew. Use code WINE101 to get your first month absolutely free. Cheers!